Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th annual, but first ever virtual Communicating Science Seminar. We are so excited that you all are here with us today. My name is Alana Kimbrell, and I am with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. And we run this seminar every year. I am here with several of our staff. Emily Cloyd and Stacy Baker will be helping in the chat today, so you might see them there. And our whole team is helping in various ways today. So thank you so much to all of them. So we hope you can join for as much of today as possible. In addition to the panel happening now, Public Engagement During a Pandemic. At 11 Eastern, we also have a panel using partnerships to improve public engagement across sectors. And then at 1:30 Eastern, we have 3 simultaneous 1-hour breakout sessions. Make Your Own Science Zine, a DIY workshop for communicating science with art, tools for developing public engagement activities and building capacity, which has 2 parts, one on the broader impacts wizard, one on building capacity for institutional support, and a third breakout on equity-centered community design for environmental communication and justice. At 3 p.m. Eastern, we have 3 more 1-hour breakouts. Stuck in the Middle School with You, Inspiring the Next Generation of STEM Innovators. Rapid funded research on STEM learning and engagement in the midst of the COVID-19 and racial justice crises. And research practice partnerships for advancing public engagement with science. So let's get started today by hearing from you all. You may have already started answering the first poll we had for you today. If you are in the virtual platform, you click over to polls. There's a question for you there about whether or not you've attended our seminar before. So we encourage you to answer that poll so we can hear from you. And we'll see the results coming in on my screen here. Great. Keep them coming. Looks like we've got a pretty good mix, newcomers and old comers. All right. Got a few more people coming in and joining the poll, so I'll leave it open for another few seconds. All right. Great. So our second poll is which of these sort of roles characterizes your interest or involvement with public engagement with science. So please go ahead and start that second poll. Got public engagement practitioners, scientists doing or interested in public engagement, students, communication researchers or evaluators, or a member of the public who is doing or interested in engagement. Great. All right, some answers still coming in. Looks like we've got another good mix here, folks. Okay, well, I'll leave that poll open, but switch back to my presentation here and keep going so that we can hand it off to the speakers for today. So our panels today will explore some of the best practices and research related to science communication and public engagement, inclusivity, equity, and partnerships. When we talk about public engagement with science, we're referring to intentional, meaningful interactions that provide opportunities for mutual learning and dialogue between scientists and a variety of public audiences. So speaking of dialogue, please do ask your questions today, again, in the virtual platform under the Q&A. Ask them at any time. We will be collecting those for our moderator to try to get to as many of them as we can during the discussion portion of the session. You can also follow along with the conversation today on Twitter. We'll be tweeting from @_SciComm. using the hashtag AAASMTG. We'd also really appreciate your participation in a very short survey. We'll post a link to at the end of the session. So thank you very much for that. So with that, let's get started with our first panel, Public Engagement During a Pandemic, Lessons from the Front Lines. I'd like to introduce the panel's moderator, Dr. Elise Arbach. Elise serves as Public Engagement Lead for the University of Michigan's Center for Academic Innovation. In this role, she leads strategy development as part of the university's presidential strategic area focus for faculty public engagement, conceptualizes and carries out projects in collaboration with faculty and staff, and develops opportunities for the campus community and public partners to come together to learn with and from one another. She has taught science communication and led institutional change efforts to support public engagement through a variety of projects, including as a current board member for the SciComm Trainers Network. She's also a co-founder and former director of Relate, a former NSF graduate research fellow, a prior finalist for the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Engagement with Science, and a current AAAS fellow. Elise holds a PhD in neuroscience. Elise?
Thank you so much, Alana. Good morning. So as you know, we're here to talk about public engagement in a pandemic, including highlighting our esteemed panelists and their fantastic work in engaging marginalized communities about COVID-19. But we can't talk about engaging communities that have been marginalized without also naming the systems that historically and currently contribute to oppression. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that my home institution, the University of Michigan, named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system and located in the Huron River watershed, was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by the Nishnawbe, Ishkodewan, Anishinaabe, the Three Fires people, who are the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. As I live and learn on these territories, I must keep in mind Indigenous struggles for self-determination, as well as the ongoing colonial legacies of scholarly practices. And especially at this moment, when we're all in different physical spaces right now, I encourage you to research the native lands that you live and work on and get to know the histories of these peoples and nations. I'd also like to start by acknowledging just how hard this last year has been for all of us. The pandemic and the many, many lives lost or permanently impacted by it. The rash, the most recent rash in an incredibly long history of violence against the lives and bodies of Native, Black, and Brown people. The spread of misinformation that has at times felt entirely out of control. The insurrection in our capital. It's been a lot, y'all. And I think that we're all collectively feeling the cumulative effects of this moment. And some of us are feeling it more than others. And this struggle is, in some sense, what we're here today to discuss. The theme of today's panel is public engagement during a pandemic. And in reflecting on this theme, I kept coming back to the words of Baudre Lorde. She wrote in Sister Outsider, "When I live through pain without recognizing it, self-consciously, I rob myself of the power that can come from using that pain, the power to fuel some movement behind it. I'd like to challenge us all to take a breath and to make space for reflection about what we can learn from this moment, our own experiences, as well as those of others. For me personally, two lessons that I've learned or relearned during this moment include the power of the pivot. A forced pivot is really, really hard, but it can also unlock productive avenues that may or may not have risen to the surface of the priority list before. One example is work conducted by a member of my team, Ellen Kuhn, who in the early days of the pandemic worked to develop a guide for participatory facilitation in virtual environments. This guide has now been applied in classrooms, in shared decision-making environments with community and academic partners, and many other examples. I don't think that we would have taken the time to build that resource without these circumstances, but genuinely now I can't imagine our portfolio without it. So what does this mean about how we think about what changes to the status quo are necessary at any one given point in time? The second lesson that I've relearned during this period is that our infrastructure, the power of the social and democratic norms, and perhaps especially germane to this conversation, support for public engagement is fragile. For example, our community has collectively lost a huge number of jobs, of people, of institutions. For example, the American Alliance of Museums estimates that up to a third of American museums may permanently close as a result of the pandemic. And that's just in the US. So how might we understand the dual blessing and the curse of this fragility? In this moment, what might we want to and need to leave behind for our next chapter? So for example, infrastructures and institutions that perpetuate histories and contemporary realities of colonialism, structural racism, and other forms of oppression. And conversely, what should we be working to protect and to rebuild? What supports, resources, policies might we bring to bear to support more just future institutions? All of the panelists who are here today will talk about their own powerful work, which channels painful realities, the pain of systemic disinvestment and oppression, the pain of the disparate impact of the pandemic on communities of color, into powerful actions with compassion, resolve, and grace. And these projects are examples of excellence in their own right, and their efforts and the results deserve to be celebrated. So let's celebrate them here today, even as we acknowledge the pain of this moment. As we listen to them describe their remarkable work, I challenge us all to be listening for the lessons that we can learn from them. Among others, you'll hear themes related to the critical nature of reciprocal, mutually beneficial, and respectful engagement relationships, especially those that span long periods of time. You'll hear about recognizing and leveraging the assets and strengths that already are existent in different kinds of communities, and how these strengths can be brought to bear in supporting and driving change, rather than the deficit-based approach that we know is ineffective. And we'll also hear about the critical role for people and communities of color in determining the priorities and in leading these efforts, which should highlight for those among us who have more than our fair share of privilege, the need for us to step back, to follow, to support, and to amplify the work of these great leaders. In these stories, I hear not just a translation of pain into purpose, but also lessons about how to acknowledge our histories while refusing to be overcome by them. I hope that you'll join me in celebrating their accomplishments, and I hope that you'll see how effective, ethical public engagement must and can be irrevocably tied to promoting equity and justice. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Stephen White, Esquire, is the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Science and Industry, COSI, the #1 science center in the nation by USA Today. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he founded and is the executive lead of the COSI Learning Lunchbox Initiative, a new model of distance learning with NASA, the US Department of Energy, and other community partnerships to provide learning and to bridge the digital divide for underserved youth. Over 100,000 of these kits are being distributed across the US. Stephen is the recipient of several awards, including 40 Under 40, the Columbus CEO Future 50, and the John Glenn Young Achievement Award. He has over a decade of experience in partnerships and policy, including in the US Senate. And as a first-generation student, Stephen received his master's in public policy and Juris Doctor from The Ohio State University. He currently serves as an adjunct professor in the OSU Moritz College of Law, covering nonprofit law and leadership, as well as several state and federal boards, including the International Space Station Subcommittee on Education, by the way, super cool, Stephen, and the State of Ohio STEM Committee. He's a frequent speaker at national conferences, examining innovative strategies on partnerships to address workforce and education equity. You can reach him at swhite@cosi.org and on Twitter at @StephenWhiteOH. Take it away, Stephen.
Well, Elise, thank you so much for not only that very, very nice introduction, but also the amazing work that you're doing in Michigan. And I also want to thank the AAAS for allowing me to speak here today to talk about some opportunities around partnership. And I also want to thank my distinguished colleagues who are here today as other panelists who are going to be sharing some incredible work that they are doing on the front lines. And I want to start with this. You know, this is in our household, we are big fans of Black Panther. You can see there, Stephen Jr. is a big fan. And one of the things that he loves to read is reading all about Black Panther. And I love the movie Black Panther. And when you think about Black Panther and you think about the Avengers and what they're all about, there's a common thread that runs through all those different movies that you may or may not have seen. And one is that you can do things alone, but if you have the power of partnerships to help you achieve big things, then you can do incredible work. And we love Black Panther because it encourages not only individuals from across the globe to want to go into science and technology, but also helps individuals of color think big and dream big around how they can also be superheroes. So what I'm going to talk about today is partnerships. And I'm going to talk about 3 key practices that you may want to engage in your community as you think about partnerships. And I'm going to illustrate those through a case study and examples of an initiative that COSI has done to showcase those as an example. So let's dive right in. When I say the practice of the 3 Ps, what do I mean by that? Well, the first P is priorities. The second P is powerful content. And the third P is personalization. And so when we talk about priorities, what do we mean? Well, essentially it's identifying those priorities in your community that you as either an individual or as an organization can help achieve around some of those challenges and some of those opportunities. By reviewing the data, reviewing some of the challenges, because each community is different. And while there might be some macro issues that pervade the entire country and the world, each community has its own uniqueness. And when we talk about powerful content, when you're thinking of partnerships, allowing that powerful content to generate together as a partner, both in the information that you create together, so that way it moves the needle around science and science learning, but then also powerful content to illustrate the impact of the partnership in what you are doing. And then the final P is personalization. And so as you think about partnerships, what are those things that you can do with your partner to personalize their experience? And then what are the things that you can do to personalize what I call the power of storytelling? Again, around the outcomes of your partnerships and what you've been able to create in order to impact the human lives that we are talking about. So priorities, powerful content, and personalization. So I want to illustrate each of these through a case study. COSI, by the way, is a science center based in Columbus, Ohio, 3 football fields long. Our vision and mission is to engage, inspire, and transform by being the best partner in science, technology, and industry learning. And I want to talk about the first P, those priorities, working with your partners to identify the priorities in your community. So one of the things COSI did, we've actually been closed since March. When we closed our doors, we reached out to educators across the state and across the nation. We've got thousands of educators on our advisory committee. And we looked at case studies like that from McKinsey, which talked about the global closures of schools across the world and what that would mean from moving to this in-person environment to this at-home environment, challenges, screen fatigue, lack of student engagement, the summer slide continuing from the summer into the fall, into the winter. And unfortunately, McKinsey issued another study just this past December, illustrating that that is in fact happening right now as we speak. This is an example of math scores showcasing how students are falling behind, particularly those students of color. And so we have before us this priority of a COVID canyon happening in our education system, where our students are here and they need to be here. And so how do we bridge that gap? How do we do that, right? So what COSI did is we activated on 3 fronts. One was on digital, the other was on physical, and then the third pillar was around partnerships. Again, leveraging the practice of those 3 Ps. And so on the digital implementation side, we said, what if we could engage people at home every single day? So we created a website where we would generate an activity, a hands-on activity with stuff around your kitchen cabinet and a video every single day that people from at home could use. But we recognized that there was another priority in our community that we had to work with our partners to solve, the digital divide, which was threefold: lack of equipment, lack of broadband, and lack of digital literacy. And so we looked at our Pew data and we found out that the Pew data, that the poorest of the poor, in some cases earning $30,000 or less, had access to a smartphone. So we had to meet them where they are, where they live, learn, and lounge. So we took all that great COSI Connects content and we built an app. And what was so great about that app is it had offline capability. So all you had to do was find a Wi-Fi hotspot somewhere, hit the download button, and have all those activities at home at your disposal, even without the internet. But we knew we were still missing people. And so we said to ourselves, what if we took that great COSI Connects content, even if they didn't have access to the internet or broadband or what have you, and let's put it into a box. And that was a pilot program that we did in June. And we did it with this idea of, could we align it with meals? So that way we serve those individuals who needed it the most. So we would feed their hungry lives and feed their hungry minds at the same time. And we did that. And it was a huge success. They would pick up their food for the week and pick up their STEM for the week. And it was like they were opening up Christmas morning with some of these gifts. It was amazing. And it gave birth to the official COSI Learning Lunchbox, this 9.5 by 11 box that you see here. What's in the box? Well, that brings me to my second P, powerful content. We knew we had to have the content inside of the kit in order to move the needle around education equity. So we include 5 different days of activities in there, right? And we used partnerships to help develop the content that went inside of the kits around STEM learning. Like, for example, they would get an activity guide that was included in there. We included everything from batteries to binoculars because we presumed that these kids had access to absolutely nothing. And what we did is we worked with our partners to generate that content, partners like NASA, working with Jim Bridenstine, a NASA administrator, and a NASA team, from everything around activities that could engage the youth at home around creating the next Artemis generation and the next astronauts. This is what you would see if you were to open that box, for example. The US Department of Energy, very similar, had the privilege of hosting the secretary who opened the learning lunchbox and said, we're in, we want to be part of this. And then even Hyperloop, working with the Virgin team to create a box around the amazing technology around Hyperloop, going from 0 to 200 plus miles per hour in the tube and creating the next engineers of the future. But that content had to be key. We had to back map it directly with the learning standards. So we partnered with the Department of Education to ensure that all those activities had the learning content that we needed for that powerful content. And we also addressed that digital divide through the gamification of digital literacy. Education equity, again, one of those priorities in our community. We include inside of each kit a passport that highlights people of color and women and LGBTQ, amazing people doing incredible things in science. But then the powerful content also had to be through data and evaluation. And so we tracked the amazing work that we were doing through the partnership network and shared that with our partners as well. Now we're doing a statewide deployment and a national deployment right now. And it leads me to my third P, which is the personalization with your partners. COSI builds anywhere between 500 to 1,000 of these kits per week. And when we distribute them in a socially distant manner. Cars pull up, we hand it to their window or in their trunks. And you can see the demand has been incredible. Here was St. Stephen's, location in Columbus. This is a location in Dayton, Ohio, where we showed up with 200 boxes and 1,000 people showed up. The demand was palpable, right? People were hungry for content, but we knew we had to work with our partners to personalize their experience when they were distributing those boxes. So we reached out to the mayors in all these different cities that they could become volunteers and have that personal engagement with their constituents. We partnered with members of Congress to also help distribute them, and even our own lieutenant governor who helped hand these out at Christmas as Christmas presents along with the food banks. We also partnered with our fellow museums because we knew that we wanted to highlight their powerful story and what they were contributing as well as partners. So we had to give them that personalization to engage as well. In all, in the state of Ohio, we distribute this over 7 different counties with the goal of distributing across 88 counties alone in 2021. Across the nation, we're going to be distributing across 5 different states with over 100,000 learning lunchboxes just in 2021 alone. And we're going to move from the personalization to talking about the powerful impact, not only just from an experiential standpoint, but also the stories. So we went from feeding hungry lives to feeding hungry minds to feeding hungry minds to fulfilling human services, talking about the personalized human condition of how we were helping to move the needle around STEM learning, whether it be moms that are currently using the box right now as they overcome opioid addiction and recovery, whether it's going to foster kids right now to help with the bonding of their families, even homeless individuals, because learning doesn't stop just because you may lose your home, and being able to provide them with the opportunity to learn as well. To those who are immigrants in our community, to help them with their learning and welcome them to our community. It is built off of a partnership model, and leveraging the practice of these 3 Ps, we've been able to create over 100 partners just around this case study alone. And so I'll end with this. You know, one of the events we did was at a park. We passed out the food and they got the meals as well, and they got their STEM learning. And this little girl took the box and ripped it open right then and there and started doing the science on the slides of the very park that we were at. And so I encourage you, focus on those 3, the practice of those Ps: priorities, personalization, and powerful content, because each and every one of you are science heroes. And our superpowers combined, let's assemble to be able to solve the problems of education equity in this moment of time where we're dealing with not only a reawakening of societal inequities, but also that great digital divide, but then also the COVID canyon that we're seeing across the educational landscape. Thank you so much. And look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in person after this pandemic is over. And with that, I will turn it back over to Elise.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really loved hearing about the convergence of multiple strategies to attack wicked problems by forming partnerships across groups that don't necessarily always work together. And I'm looking forward now to hearing our next guest, Alicia Torres, talk just a little bit about how she's leveraged partnerships that she's built over the very long term to think about meeting needs in a new context. So Alicia Torres, PhD, serves as the Senior Director of Communication for Science and Hispanic Outreach at Child Trends, which is a leading nonprofit research development center. Dr. Torres is an expert in the field of public understanding of science and has served as PI for several informal STEM learning National Science Foundation grants. She holds a doctorate in communication science from the University of Texas at Austin, where her focus was on strategic communications and mass media studies. She brings almost 20 years of experience in the planning, development, implementation, and evaluation of science communication programs. And prior to her service at Child Trends, Dr. Torres led the science communication and policy units of several STEM associations, including the American Institute of Physics, my home society, the Society for Neuroscience, and the American Educational Research Association. Alicia?
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Elise and Stephen. That was fascinating. Just really wonderful, wonderful work. Okay, I'm going to be speaking today about applying communication science to the communication of science during the pandemic. And I'd like to begin with a short definition. Communication science is the scientific study of that communication process, both the verbal, the nonverbal messages, including the creation, the delivery of the messages, the interpretation by the audiences, and the evaluation of the success of that so that we can improve the communication process. And I wanted to bring this up because frequently I find that people use the term communication science to mean science communication. And I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on this because it is a very important field of study that helps us understand how to best communicate many things, including science communication. So when we are practicing and applying it to science communication, frequently what we want to do is we want to implement strategic communication. And that is when messages are developed with a specific intent that triggers stages of learning, for example. We frequently want to build knowledge about the science that we're communicating, then have that develop into value for that science. And in many cases, we're also wanting for that value to help trigger adoption of science-based behaviors. So here we are on the left-hand side of the screen here. We have a message. We want to reach our target audience. And frequently we go through a transmission medium, and that could be something like the news media. And it's very important that for us, for this communication process to be successful, is that we start by looking and understanding our target audiences, including how the transmission medium makes decisions, what do they care about, because they may have their own goals and objectives with respect to that target audience, which may not be the same as ours. So it is very important that we take all this into consideration so that we can adapt our messages and really increase the probabilities of a successful communication process. Frequently, sometimes when we send messages, the target audience doesn't interpret it the way we intended, and the transmission medium doesn't pick it up. And so that's when we really need to remind ourselves that messages must align with the audiences. And that is understanding and doing research prior to developing messages that deal with the interests, the needs, and the trusted sources of any one of our audiences. So during the pandemic, science has been in the making on the world stage. It has been a great opportunity to communicate science because all eyes are on science. And the stakes are really high because how quickly and how well we're going to come out of this pandemic relies on the public understanding of the science behind COVID pandemic, as well as the adoption of science-based behaviors. And despite a history of high levels of value for science in the United States, we all know that there have been a lot of challenges to the veracity of science over the past year. And this presents threats to the well-being of families. The pandemic is widening the racial and economic disparities of the country, as we have already, as Stephen was addressing. And in addition to many of the things Stephen pointed out, we've also had unprecedented levels of child stress levels. And parents have been having to navigate not just their children, but understand maintaining the economic stability of their homes, the physical and mental well-being of their families, as well as the education that Stephen was referring to. And while scientists have developed science-based approaches on how to help mitigate the impacts on child development, many adults in children's lives do not have access to that research because because the research has found that access to scientific research is linked to levels of education. So in response to this urgent need to communicate accurate science-based information to the public, Child Trends applied and received an NSF Rapid Grant to translate science-based information into meaningful practice-based recommendations, and to leverage our existing project, which is called the Child Trends News Service Project, to support under-resourced families with a focus on Latino families, and to pilot the use of data science to conduct no contact audience research, which we needed to be able to form our successful messages. So why do we focus on Latinos? Latino children represent 1/4 of all children in the United States right now. They are the fastest growing, largest racial ethnic group in the country. By 2050, it is expected that Latino children will represent 1/3 of all children, which will be similar to whites. However, there's one important difference, and Latinos are disproportionately poor to many of their peers, as 2/3 live at or near poverty. Why do we focus on local TV? Because local TV remains the #1 US source of news for the majority of the public. And the demographics of local TV reveal a cross-section of scientifically underserved audiences. For example, 47% of adults with high school diplomas or less regularly rely on local TV news. 46% of those that make less than $30,000 a year regularly rely. And Latinos and African Americans in high numbers, 79% and above, regularly rely on local TV news. So how did we do this? We basically, 3 years ago, Child Trends, a research organization, partnered with professional news syndicators, Ivanhoe Broadcast News. Together, we produce 8 monthly news reports for local TV news, and Ivanhoe syndicates it out to TV stations throughout the country through what we have labeled the Positive Parenting newsfeed. The purpose is to ensure that parents have regular access to the research to inform their parenting through trusted sources, accessible formats, and that it is scientifically accurate. We launched in 2017 with 16 stations, and right before the pandemic, we had 118 stations. Those stations regularly air in 56% of the United States local TV news markets. And on average, the Nielsen data research that we use to track our views, each news report is garnering about 35 million views throughout the country. When we started this project 3 years ago, we did a lot of audience research with Latino parents and others. But we looked at the topics people cared about, the elements of stories that resonated, those things that triggered adoption of behaviors, and those things that were more difficult to communicate. This research helped us to define our message and to form our messages and to prepare our program for a randomized controlled trial impact study. And that study found that exposure to these news reports resulted in significant impact on various indicators that lead to the adoption of science-based parenting practices. So this program became a very important one at the beginning of the pandemic to be able to reach the scientifically underserved families. But the challenge we had is how can we do the research? How can we do the audience research? So we looked at digital data scans because we could work on this to take the pulse of parenting, to adapt our messages, then to address the needs of parenting. We did virtual focus groups to test those messages, and we did Zoom interviews. The digital data scans looked for information parents searched for, the concerns they had, the misinformation that they were being exposed to, the misunderstandings about topics that were evident. We did all of these scans and came up with 5 topics: how to help children regulate their emotions and behavior, how to keep kids learning and safe at home, and vaping and COVID-19, is there a relationship? And how to better understand epidemiological models. And I just want to give you a little bit more information about one of those, which was this one about the models. We know as science communicators that models facilitate science-informed decisions. They provide predictions about infections and deaths related to certain inputs, the social distancing or wearing masks. And as the inputs change, the predictions are going to change. However, when we did our scans, we found widespread misconceptions and misunderstandings. The searches found that they were called meaningless models. They failed to predict the number of deaths. They overestimated the number of deaths. The response to these models are overreactions. And instead of what we would like families to take away from these models is, oh, look at this. If we can keep our families safe if we practice social distancing and wearing masks. So that is what we went to address in our news report when we created that news report. And I can't get into all 5 in these few minutes, but I just want to draw your attention to this column, the number of views that each of these 5 stories garnered. On average, 90 million views for each of these stories. And it was just, we were very surprised. The average we used to have, as I mentioned before, is 35 million, and that was high. But this was off the charts. So just to wrap up, the key to successful communication process begins with doing audience research. Digital data scans can complement traditional ways of doing this. They provide organic insights into audiences concerned, real-time data, low-cost data collection, and it can be done in multiple languages to support cultural responsive communication. And while we've used it for television, it can be used to inform other types of communication processes, at science communication more broadly, for example. So when the communication of science, the study of how to communicate can be very important for successful communication of science, whether you're working through the mass media, social media, museums, schools, after school programs, community programs. It is very important that communication, effective science communication can really help build promote the promotion of I'm having trouble seeing my final thing here. I'm so sorry.
Alicia, you might want to unmute. I think you accidentally muted.
I'm sorry. Okay, I touched something there and I was off. Okay, so basically, effective STEM communication can help improve the lives and prospects of children, secure our future workforce, build value for science, and secure an appropriate role for STEM in society. So that said, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alicia. I hope that you all were as inspired by the powerful use of data in thinking about not just how to formulate a communication strategy, but also how to implement it. And those impact numbers are truly incredible. So our final speaker is going to be talking about now also the importance of who the messengers are for these science messages. And her name is Crystal R. Emery. Crystal R. Emery is the founder and CEO of URU, The Right to Be Incorporated, a nonprofit content production company. She's a member of the Producers Guild of America and the New York Women in Film and Television Association, and she's a AAAS If Then ambassador. Emery has been hailed as inspiring by the LA Times and as a leader in science and technology in the Good Housekeeping feature 50 over 50, Women Who Are Changing the World. I'm certainly inspired by her. I imagine that all of you will be as well. She has extensive publishing credits, including Time, Variety, HuffPost, and Stat, an action plan for replacing the broken system of recruitment and retention of underrepresented minorities in medicine with a new paradigm, which was published in the National Academy of Medicine. Her work covers such issues as diversity, inclusion, equity, accessibility, STEM education, and environmental stewardship. She's been a keynote speaker for distinguished institutions and multiple media platforms, including the National Security Agency, the National Institute for Health, the National Organization on Disabilities, Kaiser Permanente, AAAS Emerging Researchers National Conference, TEDx Beacon Street, and the Global Disability Innovation Fund. Emery's contributions have been recognized with numerous awards, including the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust Leadership and Journalism Award and an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Connecticut. Crystal, it's all yours.
Good afternoon. And I'm pretty honored to be here and to be here with Alicia and Stephen. I got a lot to learn. When I grow up, I want to be just like you. Thank you for AAAS for allowing me to join this panel of real change makers. You know, we talk about change is here or change is coming, but you guys are the real change makers. You're making it happen. And when all this is over, I would love to have an opportunity to speak with you. And Steve, I need 2,000 lunch boxes for here in Connecticut. And I'm saying this publicly so that I can hold you to it. At least thank you very much for your introduction. Where do we start, right? You know, the mountain is so big. And each of us are generals approaching it from a different aspect. So let's see these slides. Okay, so my current project that I'm working on is called Our Humanity. But the real thing is I'm about transforming the narrative and today to talk to you about engaging marginalized communities. So this is I love this wall piece that we were at the National Academy of Science and we had to come up with, you know, how do you transform from conversation to action? And this woman just did a great job. You know, where do we go? Creating an ecosystem. How do we do that? You know, how do we build through community? How do we leverage assets? You know, what is the supply and demand? And this right here represents everything we do, whether it's Alicia, whether it's Stefan, whether it's Lise, whether it's AAAS. Like each of us has a component on this chart. Right. So I am a filmmaker, right? And I run You Are You the Right to Be, which is a content production company. And you might say, well, exactly what is that? Well, we're at the intersection of arts and humanities and science and technology. And why do we have to be at the intersection? Because that is the way our world is working. You know, before it was very solo, just siloed. Somebody was over here, somebody was over there. But in order for us to move the needle forward, we have to change around, come together. And what I do, multimedia, is that intersection. Excuse me. People underestimate the power of a narrative and the power of media as effective tools for changing the narrative, which is really changing people's belief system. But as a filmmaker, I create narratives, right? I take you on a journey. I take you from place A and move you. My work is firmly grounded in creation, and transformation, and more about how do we take the academic community, the researchers, and bring them on a journey to better understand the communities that they want to write about or research about to make it more effective and also less less disrespectful in a way towards that community. Excuse me, I have been working like every day for 12 hours a day. So if you can hear my voice, could you just shake your head? Thank you. I feel like a person who smoked a carton of cool cigarettes and then went to a jazz concert with a bottle of scotch. So, God, bear with me. Good, you're right. I want to look at the word marginalized, right? Because we throw that word around a lot, and we may not explicitly say it, and perhaps, the definition seems a little given, but implicit biases make people lean towards improper assumptions about marginalized groups. And so you see, the definition is to regulate to a, unimportant or powerless position within a society or a group. People assume that if you're marginalized, you're poor, you are lacking the uh, ability to understand, or you have the inability to learn. And so I know Elisa and Stephen, you deal with this all the time. Your peers say, well, that's a marginalized group. And they automatically assume that they're not capable of some function or that they're poor. And, so this slide, my job is media, right? And media is everything, right? Everywhere you go. So this figure here looks at, what people think about scientists and engineers that are portrayed on TV and in the movies, right? So, the stereotype is, nerds mixing chemicals. That's the strongest. I'm going to talk about the oranges, though. Cool people with interesting ideas and experiences. You see that is orange, and then blue means sometimes. Um, Successful men and women with satisfied careers. Again, that is an orange, which means never. Um, and then on the bottom, you see scientists and engineers are largely ignored by TV and television, meaning that people really ever or never see positive images of people of color in those positions. So you can't be what you can't see. And that sets the tone for how researchers approach our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Good. So my question here is, are you willing to meet people where they are, right? Did you do your due diligence in investigating what makes your audience smile, right? Not just what makes your audience, flunk X, Y, and Z test or what is missing in their community. But if you approach your subjects with what makes them smile, what is important to them, not just what you think is important to them, but what they have to say and express about their lived experiences. So these are two pictures. One is the top one with my babies in white coats. We did a chemistry day, right? So we met them where they are. And that was in Atlanta, held at Morehouse. So, what do young minds, especially their age group, know about chemists. They don't know anything, right? So we got to meet them where they are. We made perfume that day. We made perfume and we made lotions, right? I am meeting them where they are. They want something that's going to smell good. But what they don't know is a chemist makes that. And the young lady sitting down next to me is a chemist. She is one of the rarest chemists in her field. So for them to see somebody that looks like them, that smiles like them, and to be involved in a science project that is something that they can relate to. And so I say to research community, because you got to meet people where you are. On the other side is a virtual reality game that I created, right? So where is young people? They are gamers, right? And so I created a game, but the game is really allows them to be a doctor, right? It allows them to take control of the emergency room. My point here is that when you are engaging young minds, you have to meet them where they are. Now, I'm going to tell you about me being a virtual reality game producer. There are like less than 20 women. Now, there's a lot that say they're a virtual reality producer, but there are less than about 20 women who have actually designed a game and put it out in public. So even by the example of me being able to do that, they get to see what they can be. And I find it many times that academic researchers go into an environment looking for a problem. Of course, that's what you do. But while you're looking for the problem, you also should look at what works, what is good, because if you look at what is good and you understand why it's working, it really gives you a better insight into whatever that other question you're asking. Good. So, we get these stereotypes, right? The roles of scientists and researchers, they always look so sort of sterile. But by the nature of your STEM profession, you're removed from the average person. So between the myths about what a researcher is or academic, and then with the virus, this has exacerbated the digital divide and made it even more difficult for us to find mutual productive ways to connect. And make sure you keep me on time here, somebody. Good, good. So I want to take a moment to talk about the marriage of art and academics, media and narrative research and outreach and building bridges. It's really important that we create this marriage, right? So this is Dr. Victor Zhao, the president of the National Academy of Medicine, who is a great supporter of the work that we do. And then over here is Mitch Resnick, and he's the Scratch programmer, right? So here's me, somebody that, was every marginalized stereotype. I grew up in a public housing. At some point, my mother became a single parent. And for the record, though, we did have a dad who was very active in our lives. But if you look at where the statistics from, here is a marriage of the work that I do and the shaping the narrative and meeting with some of the best minds in the business, right? And this is what a collaboration looks like. And both Stephen and Alicia, I know you know this by the work that you're doing. We have to marry art, right, which lowers the defense mechanism And we got to combine it with academics and research, which helps us explain the why and the how. But we also need policymakers. It can't be a one-sided bridge. So when you're looking at these photos here, you have my babies on the left with Unilever doing chemistry. You have a very diverse group in the middle. And then we do this exercise with our kids to listen to each other's heart. Because think about it, most people have never heard their heartbeat. So when you let them hear their heartbeat, and you let them hear somebody else's heartbeat, it shows that we have much more in common. And I would say that all researchers, particularly going in a Black and Brown Indigenous community, bring a stethoscope and listen to your heart, listen to your hearts of your subjects, let them listen to your heart. I'm telling you that exercise would show that you are more connected than you are different. Um, we got to build a two-way bridge, right? Bridge of stakeholders, community, researchers, policymakers, because we really don't get anything done without all of us coming to the table. It can't just be the researcher side and a lot of data collected. Does the community ever get that data? Do the policymakers ever really read it? Do the policymakers actually read the people in the community that they make policy for? And this is the work that we do. Go ahead, Roy. So, how is a global pandemic affecting public engagement with science? You know, Marginalized communities, were already locked out right before COVID 19. The digital divide was so big, right? So now we're in the middle of widespread infodemics, in which misinformation, disinformation are spreading widely and rapidly. The average person is trying to survive. So, how do we, engage with science? So, I'm going to tell you this. I was asked to do a series of these. I don't recommend you try this at home. You did, yeah. I did a first grade class and a fifth grade class in Tennessee. So some of the students were in the classroom and others were remote. Do you know how much energy it takes to engage a first grader through remote? Right? I mean, somebody recommended me for a MacArthur Genius Award, right? And so I had to make it very physical, right? I had to get them to jump up and down, right? And then I had to get them to touch their toes. But while they touched their toes, I asked them to think about the shoes that they were wearing and who made those shoes. What kind of person, where did the material come from? Right? Because you have to work with what they have. My fifth graders, I did a popcorn exercise, right? So the old exercise, you have a kernel and you put it with heat and oil, and then you create this popcorn. So every kid, almost every household, has a microwave. I have one, but I don't ever use it. But this engaged them. It was meeting them where they are. And it was silly, but afterwards it lowered their defense mechanism. That they were able to have a conversation with me in a way that they couldn't with other people. So, the virus, has made it even more evident that we need to build a bridge, right? And we got to do it differently. The virus is forcing us to build a new paradigm. And again, Alicia and Stephen, you understand this, and you're a part of building that new paradigm. And I'm very honored to be here with you. Go ahead. How do you leverage public engagement to build connections between and among groups? Right? Well, the first one is the word respect. Like, do you really see them? Do you really see me? Do you really see us? And then can you hear us? Because if you are coming at me with a lot of preconceived notions, I feel that. I feel that vibration. I feel that disrespect. And I am less likely to want to partner with you. Again, are you willing to meet people where they are? Go ahead, Rev. What are you willing to do to meet them there? You know, recently we did a big campaign for our humanities. And my team kept saying, oh, you don't have transgender, or oh, you don't have this. So I'm listening to them. And we came up with some new artwork. And I already knew what I was going to say, but I just was going to let them go through the process. And I said, you know, are you guys satisfied with what this looks like? Blah, blah, blah. They're like, yeah. And then I go, well, why the hell isn't there anybody in here in a wheelchair? Right? Like, my own team did not meet me where I was. Right? They thought about everybody else outside of me, but they missed me. Go ahead, Jared. Here is an example of meeting people where they are. So the COVID-19 vaccine, the facts and fiction, was a flyer for a town hall that a very famous hospital system produced. Right? It looks sterile. It's, over here, the one that says COVID-19 safety, the new vaccine strain, the new strain of the vaccine, is what I produce, right? Which one is more engaging to a community of color, right? Which one says, I see you, I want to bring you in? Which one looks sterile, and what is this? And you just throw it away. Right, this is my point. You gotta meet people where they are. All of our work is in Spanish. Some of it is even translated in some Native American language. The problem there is they have like 56 different dialects. But we were working in Albuquerque. Go ahead, Joanne. Our Humanities Advisory Committee. So when you're doing work and you want to ensure that all people are at the table, can I use this picture? Because there's a head of a health system. There are foundations. There are ministers. There are policymakers. There is the co-chair of the appropriation committee, right? Like, in order for us to really move forward, and again, a lot of times, and I'm saying this because this is a research community, and a science community, is that you have a board of folks that are all just like you, but we are multidimensional people, and we need multidimensional boards or committees to help design the work, or else it becomes very one-sided. Go ahead, Brian. This is building bridges, the power of the sisterhood. So this is a project that I designed. This is probably its 8th or 9th year. And it is about women in STEM coming together and building and becoming allies, right? And it's multi-generational, it's multicultural. But the point is, this is how you build a bridge. And so in order for us to survive this digital divide, in order for us to move forward, especially within the STEM realm, and engage our young people, we have to build bridges. And we have to build them together. Okay. And that's it for me. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot building bridges. We had a Twitter party. Great, but here are the questions. What can engagement look like? How do I avoid complacency? How do I maintain momentum? I forgot about that one. Go ahead, Ryan. Okay, so I hope that was helpful to somebody, anybody. But thank you very much. And again, thank you guys for allowing me time in your space.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I am personally very, very moved by all of the examples that you provided about meeting people where they are and trying to really look for what brings people smiles, what brings people joy as a point of connection. I think it's a beautiful idea. So before we transition into audience questions, I'm going to offer some extraordinarily brief remarks so that you can continue to hear from our remarkable panelists about their amazing work to just see if I can tie some of the themes of what we heard together. So Crystal talked quite a bit about starting with what a community brings, their assets, their strengths, their joy, their value. And I love the image of what makes people smile as a starting place for public engagement with science. Alicia built on this by talking about the power of data and how you develop data-based approaches to think about what kinds of opportunities you might be able to pursue to meet different types of needs. And then Stephen talked about the power of building really multifaceted, multidimensional relationships that address multiple challenges, which recognize how intertwined so many of the challenges that our world faces really are. We can't address public engagement with science without addressing things like basic human needs. We heard about different types of divides and different approaches to bridging these divides. And so I just want to highlight that the divides between us are bridgeable. And I think that one of the things that's so powerful about Crystal's comments was how many different avenues and different inroads we can take in order to be able to form human-to-human connections. We can think about the relationships between different types of wicked problems and think about strategically connecting the dots between public engagement with science efforts and other efforts that meet people's basic human needs, the way that Stephen highlighted. And in doing that, we can start to address some of these larger, higher Maslow hierarchy order challenges, like the things like digital divide and access to science information that Alicia highlighted. So I just want to pause and again, from the bottom of my heart, express my deepest gratitude for all of our speakers in sharing your wisdom. And I'm personally really excited now to transition into the question and answer part of this discussion for a few minutes. If you're not aware of it already, for those of you listening in, AAAS is hosting Q&A through Slido. So please do submit your questions there. And there's a fabulous team working in the background to send them my way. So I'd love to talk a little bit first about partnerships, in part because that's where the bulk of the questions so far have come from, and in part because I think that that's one of the uniting themes among all of your comments. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about where you see similarities and differences across your different forms of partnerships with different types of partners, with media production companies, with television networks, with nonprofit organizations, with governmental organizations. What similarities do you see across all of these partnerships, and where do you see divergences or differences? So I'll start maybe with Alicia or Stephen.
I'm happy to take a stab at this. I think that I think that at least in our case, it has been clear partnerships together are stronger. So you basically, what you bring to the table and what another partner brings to the table is really important to look at that together. Where's the power of that? And then, how do you implement it? Because, there is an overlap. And so I think, at least in our case, it's so important to have very clear roles. For example, we as the research group in this media partnership, we can bring and vet the scientific accuracy, but, the TV folks, they don't want us telling them how to tell the story, because that's the work that they do. So it's very important that you develop processes and procedures and working together that really focus on the strengths that each one brings to the table, and that when there's a process of, hey, maybe we don't agree on something. How are you going to take care of that? What's the process for, coming to a solution with respect to that?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. Alicia, I think you're spot on. And a couple of things I would add is that just sort of the in this together, right? We see that hashtag popping up across states around the country. And one of the common threads that I've seen as we as a community have sort of all worked together and to address some of these problems is that there is a recognition of the problem, right? That we haven't really seen before. And we saw that at length, that some of these problems have always been there, right? I mean, the gap that we talked about, that Crystal talked about, Alicia talked about in the educational system around education equity, it's been there. But what the pandemic has done is it's created this sort of magnifying glass from what we've seen. And so I think partners across the board are starting to recognize a bunch of different things. One is that, to Crystal's point, the digital divide is real. And digital deserts exist across our countries, and we've got to be able to solve that problem to provide access to tools so that way students can be successful, families can be successful in an environment that's digital. When we have a tech tsunami that's coming before us, like what we see today, and we use all kinds of digital assets from Chromebooks to iPhones to what have you, we have to be able to create that equalized playing field for our children. So there's a recognition of that, right? There's also a recognition of the educational gap that I mentioned earlier, and that Alicia and Crystal referred to as well, in the disparities among the haves and the have-nots. Those individuals who are from underserved communities, poor communities, those individuals, those people, children of color and students of color, there's a recognition of that as well. And finally, there's a recognition of, as we look at the unemployment landscape, I would challenge that, when you talk about STEM, these are the jobs of the future. And if you look at the gap right now in the pipeline of STEM talent, there's a disproportionate lack of women, lack of people of color going into STEM pathways. And so there's a recognition of that. And so, to Alicia's point, all of these partners sort of recognize these different problems right now, but the pandemic has created this necessity to work together to solve the problem. And so we leverage the strengths of each other. COSI, we're great at cosifying stuff, making things fun, engaging, hands-on for kids to want to engage. And so we leverage that power and that strength with our partners who might have a different strength. And so I think there is a lot of common threads. And it's some of it's been born out of the pandemic, but candidly, some of these problems have been here well before the pandemic, and we're all working together to try to solve them.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Alicia, for making those important points. Stephen, you actually referenced a question that came in through your comments actually are connected to one of the comments or questions that came in through one of the audiences, and it's directed specifically for Crystal. So in thinking through some of the challenges associated with challenges that are problems that are not new, that are historically have very, very deep roots, but have renewed emphasis. Have you been surprised about who does or doesn't understand the meaning of marginalization, especially as you described it in your remarks? And if you have any polling data, that individual was also really interested in hearing if there was polling data about the understanding of marginalization that you referenced.
Stephen or Alicia, do you have any data about that question? Yeah, that's a sort of different kind of question. Look, these problems have been here forever, right? And personally, I don't like the identification of being called a marginalized person, right? Like the usage of that word is sort of demeaning, right? It means that I am on the outside of something, right? When I am inside and fully, here. So these identification labels need to be readdressed because they're not inclusive. They're actually very limited in what their definition is and understanding. I don't know if that answers your question, Alicia or Stephen.
I would just echo that, Crystal. I think you're, as someone who, myself grew up in underserved community. It's a recognition of when you go into environments that folks you're the only one, or there's individuals that look different. The labels itself, from what we've seen, is something that we also need to address as well, as because those are structures that those individuals who are trying to make their way through and trying to achieve their dream can be roadblocks. So I would agree with that, Crystal, that we have to look at some of these structural issues that we have as a society.
Thank you both. I think that actually does a really lovely job of capturing another divide, which is divide in language, and how language itself can become a mechanism for division. So thank you for that call to action, for that deep self-reflection. I'm interested in maybe continuing the conversation around how we can also think about what tools we might bring to bear to examine the challenges that we're facing, and also to give rise to some of the innovative opportunities for solutions. And this really speaks to the theme of data that Alicia brought up in her talk. So a question from the audience is, where can we learn more on how to conduct digital data scans and the best, most equitable practices associated with those?
Well, I can tell you that we have hired 2 data scientists at Child Trends, and they are beginning to. I mean, obviously there are concerns about how big data can be used, right? There are very legitimate concerns related to privacy, related to people who may not even know that their data is being used this way. So at the same time, there are ways of working with that information that's available to try to bring about more effective programs that will serve the communities. So I think that I don't know exactly where you can get that information, and perhaps I can provide you, Elise, or AAAS with some information. I can gather that information and provide it for you so that you can share it with the person who made the question after this. But I do know that it has been quite game-changing in the way we do a lot of the research at Child Trends, because we're beginning to understand that there are other ways, and that there's a real benefit to be able to access information. And quite frankly, during the pandemic, we were able to work on practicing good science communication, using the important, basically to do research, audience research, to inform the effectiveness of our programs. And like that, there's many other uses that data science scans can be used for in terms of improving a lot of the nonprofit programs and initiatives.
So I have a big issue here because data scans and data collection
I know where you're going.
data
Yes.
itself can be so manipulated, right? And it's ridiculous. You can make data say whatever you want because it's how you present the question. And what I think is more important is looking at how you are presenting that question. I know that when I did a discussion paper for the National Academy of Science, we talk about percentages. Oh, there's only 2% Black women doctors, or there are only 5% of Black doctors, or 4.5 of Hispanic. What does a percent mean if it has no context to the reader? So my question was, how many Black and Latina doctors would have to graduate every year to make the playing ground represent the demographics of our country? right? So, you got these low percentages. But you know what those numbers, and nobody would touch it, right? No mathematician would touch it. And why wouldn't they touch it? Because they were afraid of what the data would have shown, right? And we took data from everywhere. And what did it show? It showed that we would need something like, and don't quote me on this number because I'm not looking at it, but something like 56,000 Black and Latinos to graduate every year from now until 2060. How many do we graduate collectively? Maybe 3,000, right? Maybe 3,000. And I remember one of the readers wanted to soften the comment, right? So took our data and just rewrote it a little bit. And I was like, no, that's not going to happen. So when I have to say to data people, I can't give you, where you're going to go find the exact tools. But what I can give you this is, don't manipulate the data that you want it to be by the way that you ask the question. Ask real questions that give you the truth of the work and not what you hope it would be.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So before I sort of move us into synthesis, I just want to highlight that again, I think that this is another really fantastic example of how a system that can be used for good, used towards making a more just and equitable society, i.e. using data, can also be used for harm. And so I think that this really reinforces the need for us to work collectively and to form strong partnerships with communities of color and with leaders of color to make sure that their seats, their voices are at the table and can not just point the direction of where we should collectively be going, but also to be able to ask some of those really hard questions that Crystal identified. So as much as I would love to continue this discussion for many, 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 many more minutes, we are unfortunately running out of time. And so I'm going to pose one final question to each of our speakers, as well as to each of the members of the audience. And you can respond to this question as a member of the audience, and we'll display it as a word cloud shortly. So the question for members of the audience is what is one word that you'll be taking away, thinking about, holding on to, holding in your heart, or otherwise spending some time with over the course of the next couple of days from this discussion this morning? And the parallel question that I'd like each of our speakers to address in turn is similarly, what have you learned from the past year in particular that you hope to carry forward with you once this pandemic ends? So why don't we start with Crystal, and then we'll go to Stephen, and then end with Alicia.
Okay, first let me apologize, Stephen and Alicia, because I ran over. You know what I learned? Spiritual warriorship, right? Like looking at Stephen and looking at Alicia, they understand spiritual warriorship. And that as we see more people speaking their truth and standing up, we are creating a tsunami of spiritual warriors to create a new paradigm. And that is what I've learned this year, that spiritual warriorship.
So one of the things that, one of my favorite quotes is, it's actually a Mozart quote where he says, be silent if you choose, but when it's necessary, speak, and speak in such a way that people will remember it. And as we think about this pandemic and what we've gone through over this last year, one of the things that I've learned is that each of us plays a role, and each of us can become a science ambassador, regardless of our background, regardless of where we're from, regardless of what we may believe. Each of us has a unique role around science education and being able to help us collectively move the needle to increase science literacy and to lift up other people. And we can do so and do it together through partnerships. And our collective will rise that tide and lift all boats. But one of the things that I take away from the pandemic is hope that we can continue to move in that direction of working together to create these solutions. But it requires all of us.
Let me unmute myself. Yes, I would like to say that um, if there's one takeaway I would have this year is, a society without science in this day and age is a very scary thought. And, we've come very close to experiencing a lot of that this past year. And, we've enjoyed pretty much for many years, as I mentioned in my presentation, public trust in science. But, that's been whittled away. And so much of the future depends on building that value for science, trust for science into our daily lives, that the work that all of us are doing, not just the three of us here, but all of us are working on, public awareness, public value for science and STEM, all areas of STEM, um, and its appropriate role in society. That is one of the most important things that I think for, the future of our country, for the future of society, for the future of, my grandchild who's 2 years old, and I look in his eyes and I think, what is the world going to be like for you when you're 25? And so, those right now, the work that we're talking about, the effectiveness of all the collective work that all of us are doing is so important. So I want to thank you guys, and obviously thank AAAS for organizing this session and others like it. And to the panelists, and Elise, you did a beautiful job putting it all together, providing context and adding a lot of value. So thank you all.
And thank you. I think that one of the things that I feel the most sad about with doing this panel virtually as opposed to in person is not being able to shake each of your hands and thank you for your fantastic work. And so, and similarly, I'm sad that we can't experience the collective standing ovation that I'm positive would be happening right now if we were all in person. So while I'm excited that I can wear my fuzzy slippers while talking to all of you, I'm also hoping that we can recreate as much digital positive energy, and thanking you for your fantastic work and for sharing your comments. So it's genuinely been a pleasure, and as I'm going to hand things back over to Alana. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you all so much. So I'm showing now on the screen the word cloud that from our audience. So if you have not yet responded to our third poll, you can toggle over in your virtual platform to the polls, and please go ahead and fill that out. That would be great. Got a nice word cloud going already. Bridges, partnership, community. I'll give you another few seconds to respond to that if you haven't already. So thank you all so much for participating. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of your questions, but we really appreciate all of you being here today. And I have a few more things I want to point out before we wrap up today, just in the next couple of minutes. So I'm going to pull my slides back up. All right. So we did this already. So here's a link to the survey. If all of you could just copy that into your browser to fill out afterwards, it just takes a couple of minutes. We would so appreciate that. And I also want to point out that this is a PDF we've put together with lots of public engagement and science communication related sessions at the annual meeting next week. So plenty of them are also free and under the public events pass. So that URL there will take you to that PDF. I also want to point out that next week, Wednesday, we have a ceremony at 4 p.m. Eastern to honor 2 public engagement award winners, our BAMIC Award for Public Engagement with Science and our Early Career Award for Public Engagement with Science. So we're really, really proud to share those and celebrate those amazing women next week, Wednesday at 4. Also next week, Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, we have a virtual public engagement networking reception. So we hope you can join us for that. And we'll see you back at 11, I hope, Eastern for our next panel on partnerships to improve public engagement across sectors. So thank you all again so much for joining us today, and we'll see you later.